Okay, so now that we've looked at the CSS display property, I want to cover another CSS property that's really important for layout, and that is the float. And the main thing that this allows us to do is to wrap text around a particular element. What exactly does this allow us to do? So we've seen previously that by changing the display, we could, for example, make our blocks go onto the same line. So maybe there's one here and there's another inline block here. There could be another inline block here, and we could use 3 inline blocks to achieve this layout. But if we wanted our text to be able to wrap around another element, such as in this case, where it's kind of this misshapen L, then this is going to require us to use the float property. The web really is an extension of print. Previously, we used to have these newspapers, and the way we lay out images and text is kind of what we've borrowed in order to create the websites that we see these days. You realize very often in the world how so many things get reused in different ways, and getting good at a particular thing, like laying out newspapers, even if this skill dies, it still usually gets transferred into something else. How do we use the float property? So here, let's say that we have an image tag. I don't have the full content of the image or the text, just so that we can save some space here and understand what's going on in the CSS. But you can imagine this is an image element with the source, with an alt tag, and this is a text with some lorem ipsum that's about a paragraph long, and it looks something like this. In the style.css, let's go ahead and target the image and make it float left. Float is the name of the property, and left is the value that we're setting that property to. And as soon as this CSS is applied, then what you'll see is that our text will now begin to wrap around our image. So it fits around the image. And we've done this by making this image float to the left. We're not actually setting anything on the text here. We can also change that float to right to make the image go to the right of the page and for the text to wrap on the left. And those are probably the only 2 values we're going to be using on the float property. Essentially, if we had a normal HTML file with respecting the normal HTML flow, then images by default have a display block. So they're going to take up the full width, even if they don't need to. And then paragraph elements also are display blocks, so take up the full width, and then so on and so forth. But if we wanted the text to wrap around the images, then we can simply take the image and set this one to float left and this other one to float right. And now these 2 elements are now taken out of the normal HTML flow, and they're actually floating around the text. Now, sometimes though, you might not want the text to wrap around the floated element. Previously, we saw if we had an image and then we had 2 paragraph elements, then we would want the image to be floated left so that the paragraph text can flow around it. However, if instead of having 2 paragraph elements, we actually had a footer here, then we actually want the footer to be down here occupying the full width and not squished in to be wrapped around the image right here. So how do we achieve this? Because as I mentioned, the float property is set onto the image and not onto the paragraph, whereas the behavior that you can see occurs in the paragraph. So the paragraph is the one that's actually wrapping around the image. In order to fix this and allow the footer to be free of this floating image, then we need to use a related property, which is called clear. So here I've got an example where we've got an image element, a paragraph element, and finally we've got a footer. So normally in the footer, you'll see something like copyright and then the name of the company. It looks very weird having it placed here. Instead, we want it placed down here, like any normal footer. But unfortunately, because our image is floated to the left, then everything else is trying to wrap around it. So we have to change our CSS. We have to target the footer using the selector for that element. And then we have to set a property called clear. And what this clear does is it clears any responsibility to wrap around things that are floating. This footer is now cleared of the left float, and that means it can go into its normal position and ignore anything that's floating around it. And this will end up looking something like this. If we look at this layout of a web page here, you can see you might achieve this by having a block over here, which is float left, and another section here, which is float right. And this will give us this kind of separation of these two. Probably they're going to be divs, right? Probably two squares. And it allows them to line up side by side like this. Now, for the footer to be cleared of both of these, so above it there's a float left and there's something floating right, then we need to set that clear property to both. And this means it's not going to wrap the thing on the right and it's not going to wrap the thing on the left. So now let's try an exercise and see if we can apply what we learned into writing our own code and setting the float property. If you download and extract the 8.1 CSS Float starting files and open up the index.html, you should see that we've got a bunch of code that's already written for you. If you look at the preview, you can see we've got cats and we've got dogs. If we take a look at the goal image, then you can see what we're trying to achieve is to get a block that floats to the left of the page, and another one that floats to the right of the page, and then to have a footer right below those two floating blocks. Whereas at the moment, what we've got is we've got two blocks that are stuck next to each other, and we've got a footer at the bottom. And the text in our blocks don't actually wrap around the image either. So I want you to use what you've learned about float to modify the code in the style element of the index.html to achieve this goal look. So you're going to need to think about how you can float this text around this image. You're going to need to think about how you can do the same over here. And then you need to think about how you can make this block go to the right, this block go to the left, and have the footer go below both of those things. It's going to need you to apply what you learn about floats and clear. Pause the video and give that a go now. All right, so let's do the easiest thing first, which is to wrap our text around our images. If we take a look at the structure of our text, you can see we've got two images. And if we make both of these images float left, then we can probably get the text wrap to work. So let's target the image element and then set float to left. So if we look at the preview now, you can see that both of these images, once there is enough width, maybe we can view it here in a full browser. Once there's enough width, you can see that both of these paragraphs are now wrapping around our images. So that's the first part checked. Next thing we want to do is to make the cat block float to the left. So this aquamarine block go to the left and the dog block go to the right so that we can have this kind of layout. To do that, we're going to use the float again. And if we look at our code and see how it's formatted, you can see these blocks are just simply made up of divs. There's a cat div and there's a dog div. And you can see we're already targeting those divs by changing their background color to have them different. Let's go ahead and make this cat div float to the left and make the dog div float to the right. now if we look at our website, you can see it's achieved that. The clap block is on the left and the dog block is on the right, but our copyright has also gone all the way up to the top because these two things are floating. So this footer is trying to wrap around both of them, and the only space that's available is right here in the center. So we're going to have to use that trick we learned about the clear property. If we go into our footer and change the clear property so that it clears both sides of the float, then it now behaves properly and goes down right to the bottom. And now we have our layout looking more or less like the goal image. Don't worry if you have this little gap here. That's because the height of the divs are not the same, because there's different amounts of words in these paragraphs. And this brings me on to an important point about using float as we're doing here for layout. In the past, a lot of developers have used float extensively and sort of wrangled it to create these kind of complex layouts. Now, I'm showing you this layout so you can use the clear property, but in modern web development and web design, we don't actually use the float property to achieve these kind of designs, because there are much better tools for us like Flexbox, Grid, Bootstrap, whole load of other things that is a lot less complicated to use and to understand than using float to achieve this. There can be very unexpected results if you're trying to achieve complex layouts using float. So I recommend to only use float when you want to wrap text around an image. And in modern web design, this is what you're going to see most people doing as well. So it's an important concept to learn and understand, but try to not use it on everything that you see. We've got better techniques, which I'll teach you very shortly.